right now. There is a moment unfolding in Burkina Faso that almost everyone is about to misunderstand. Because nothing about it looks urgent. No breaking alerts, no dramatic speeches, no global reaction. Just a quiet scene. Drones laid out on tables, wires exposed, engineers studying them piece by piece like they're trying to decode something. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're not just using these machines anymore. They're trying to understand them, rebuild them, and eventually own them. Burkina Faso has begun developing and assembling its own surveillance drones under a Made in Faso push. Not fully independent yet, not complete. But something has clearly shifted, because once a country stops trusting what it's given and starts asking how it works underneath, that's not maintenance anymore. That's the intent. And the uncomfortable question hiding inside all of this is why now? And what changed that made this necessary? Let's find out. At first, nothing looked broken. In fact, on paper, Burkina Faso had already solved one of its biggest challenges. It had drones, modern, capable, already tested in real-world conditions. These systems could scan large areas, track movement across remote terrain, and provide something that had always been missing before: visibility. For a country dealing with vast distances and unpredictable movement, that visibility felt like control. Commanders could see what was happening beyond the reach of ground patrols. Remote zones were no longer completely blind. Decisions could be made with information instead of guesswork. So logically, this should have been the turning point. But it wasn't. Because something didn't match the expectation. The drones were working, but the system behind them wasn't fully owned. Imagine watching a live feed of your own territory, knowing something is changing on the ground, and realizing that adjusting your own system is not entirely in your hands. You can operate it, yes. You can depend on it. But the deeper layer, the ability to modify, repair instantly, or reshape how it behaves, doesn't sit with you. It sits somewhere else. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because in a slow environment, that gap might not matter. But in a fast one, it becomes everything. Every delay in repair means lost time. Every limitation in adaptation means missed opportunities. Every reliance on external support creates a window where the system cannot respond at the speed reality demands. And that's when the realization quietly sets in. The problem is not that the country lacks technology. The problem is that the technology doesn't fully belong to the country. That's a different kind of weakness, one that doesn't show up in reports, but shows up in outcomes. Because having access to a system is not the same as controlling it. And once that difference becomes clear, the entire strategy starts to shift, not toward buying more, but toward understanding what is already there. Which leads to a question that changes everything moving forward. If the system you rely on is not fully yours, how long can you depend on it before it starts limiting you? That question doesn't stay theoretical for long. Because once you begin to notice dependence, you start seeing it everywhere. At first, imported drones still feel like a strength. They are fast, reliable, and already proven. Compared to building something from scratch, they save years of effort. They give immediate results, and in high-pressure situations, that matters. But over time, a different pattern begins to appear. Every system has boundaries, and those boundaries are not yours. When something breaks, you can't always fix it instantly. When conditions change, you can't always adjust the system the way you need to. When upgrades are required, they don't happen on your timeline. Everything leads outward. And that creates a subtle shift in how power feels. What once felt like an advantage begins to feel like a constraint. It's like using a tool that works perfectly, until the moment you need it to do something slightly different. And when that moment comes, you realize you are not in control of how that tool evolves. For a country like Burkina Faso, operating in an environment that is constantly changing, that realization becomes critical. Because the Sahel does not give you time to adjust slowly. Movement patterns change quickly. Situations evolve without warning. What worked yesterday may not work today. And in that kind of environment, flexibility is not optional, it's survival. But flexibility requires control, and control requires understanding. So the logic begins to turn. Not because imported drones are ineffective, they clearly work, but because they are incomplete. They solve the problem of visibility, but they don't solve the problem of autonomy. And once that distinction becomes clear, the strategy cannot stay the same. Because continuing to rely entirely on external systems means accepting limits that you don't set. So the question sharpens. Not what more can we bring in, but what part of this system can we take back? And once that question becomes serious, it stops being a discussion. It becomes a direction. So what does it actually look like when a country starts taking back a system? Not how people expect. There's no sudden leap from importing drones to producing advanced military systems overnight. No dramatic unveiling where everything changes in a single moment. Instead, it starts in places most people would ignore. Workspaces, training rooms, tables covered with drone parts. In Burkina Faso, the shift begins with something simple but powerful. Drones are no longer treated as finished products. They are open, carefully, deliberately, piece by piece. Wires are traced, components are examined, sensors are studied not just for what they show, but for how they work. Communication systems are tested to understand how data moves from the air to the ground. This is no longer operational. This is reverse understanding. Engineers and technicians begin doing what changes everything. They stop asking, "How do we use this?" and start asking, "How is this built?" From there, small but critical steps follow. Some drone units begin to be assembled locally, even if the components are still imported. That alone changes the process because assembly builds familiarity. Familiarity builds confidence, and confidence reduces hesitation. At the same time, repairs start happening internally. What once required external intervention can now be handled on the ground, faster, with fewer delays. And then comes the most important shift: modification. Drones are adjusted, not massively, but meaningfully. Tweaks are made to suit real conditions. Performance is shaped based on actual use, not theoretical design. This is where the system starts changing character. It is no longer something that arrives complete. It becomes something that evolves locally. And that evolution does something subtle but irreversible. It moves knowledge from outside the country to inside it. And once knowledge moves, dependence begins to weaken. Because the system is no longer a black box, it becomes something that can be understood, questioned, and improved. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough to change direction. And that raises the next, more serious question. If a country begins to understand and reshape its own systems, does it still operate under the same limits as before? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. That question has a clear answer. No, the limits don't stay the same. Because the moment understanding enters the system, everything begins to move differently. At first, the change was subtle. A repair that used to take days now takes hours. A minor issue that once required external support is handled on the ground. Adjustments that previously had to wait are now made immediately. Nothing dramatic, but the timing changes, and in security, timing is everything. In Burkina Faso, this shift starts creating something far more valuable than advanced hardware. It creates responsiveness. Because once engineers and technicians understand how the system works, they stop reacting slowly. They begin responding in real time. A drone that struggles in certain conditions can be adjusted. A surveillance pattern that doesn't match movement on the ground can be refined. Maintenance is no longer a bottleneck. It becomes part of the flow. And that's where control begins to take shape. Not as a declaration, but as a function. Because control is not about owning everything. It's about being able to act without delay. And that ability grows with every layer of understanding. At the same time, the system starts aligning more closely with reality. Imported designs are built for general use. They work well across different environments, but they are not optimized for any one of them. Burkina Faso's environment is not general, it is specific. Long distances, scattered activity, unpredictable movement. and conditions that demand constant adjustment. So when the system begins to be understood locally, it also begins to be shaped locally. Not redesigned from scratch, but refined. And those refinements add up. A slightly better flight pattern, a faster repair cycle, a more relevant surveillance approach. Individually, they seem small. Together, they change how effective the system becomes. And something else is happening at the same time, something less visible, but more important. People are changing. Operators are no longer just users. They understand what they're seeing and how it's generated. Technicians are no longer dependent, they become problem solvers. Engineers move from observation to creation. That combination builds something that cannot be imported. A system supported by people who understand it. And once that exists, the direction becomes clear. Because now the question is no longer about capability. It's about independence. If control is starting to take shape inside the system, how long before dependence starts disappearing altogether? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Dependence doesn't collapse in one moment, it erodes. Slowly at first, almost invisibly. And then all at once, it becomes obvious that something has changed. In Burkina Faso, that erosion begins with small, measurable shifts. A drone that once had to be sent out for repair is now fixed locally. A system that once required external adjustment is now modified on site. A delay that used to be accepted as normal is no longer tolerated. Each of these changes seems minor, but together, they start removing something that used to define the system: waiting. And once waiting disappears, dependence starts losing its grip. Because dependence is not just about where a system comes from. It's about how much control you have over its behavior, its timing, and its evolution. And that control is now moving. Not completely, not instantly, but clearly. Instead of operating within fixed limitations, the system begins to open up. Instead of adapting to external constraints, it begins to adapt to local needs. This is where the shift becomes structural. Because once a country can maintain, adjust, and improve its own systems, even partially, it stops being locked into someone else's framework. It begins creating its own, and that changes how decisions are made. Security operations become more flexible. Responses become faster. Adjustments become part of the process instead of obstacles within it. This is not about replacing everything overnight. It's about reducing how much of the system sits outside your control. And every reduction matters. Because the more control moves inward, the less vulnerable the system becomes to delays, restrictions, or external dependencies. That's where Burkina Faso's position begins to change. Not through visible dominance, but through invisible independence. Because real strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as the absence of delay, the absence of limitation, the absence of waiting. And once a system reaches that point, even partially, it is no longer operating the way it used to. Which leads to the final and most important question. If dependence is already breaking at this level, what happens when the same process expands across everything else? That question doesn't stay contained for long. Because what's happening in Burkina Faso is not just about surveillance drones anymore. It's about a pattern. And patterns once established don't stay in one place. The same process that began with drones, opening systems, understanding them, rebuilding parts of them, and reducing dependence can now move into other areas. And it already has the foundation to do so. Because once you have engineers who understand electronics, systems, and integration, you don't just stop at one application. The knowledge doesn't sit still, it expands. The same skills used to adapt surveillance drones can be applied to agriculture, monitoring crops, managing irrigation, and mapping land. They can be used in logistics, delivering supplies to areas that are difficult to reach by road. They can even shape how infrastructure is planned and monitored. So what started as a response to a security challenge begins to evolve into something broader, a technological base. And that's where most people miss the real story. They see drones and think military tool. But the deeper reality is this: drones are just the entry point. The real shift is in system building capability. Because once a country learns how to take apart a system, understand it, and rebuild it to fit its needs, it is no longer limited to what it can import. It can begin creating what it needs, not instantly, not perfectly, but progressively. And that progression changes how the future unfolds. Because now, growth is not tied entirely to external supply. It is tied to internal capacity. That's a different trajectory. A country moving along that path doesn't just react to change, it starts shaping it. And that's where Burkina Faso's position becomes difficult to ignore. Not because it has already reached the final stage, but because it has clearly moved past the starting point. And once that happens, the direction becomes more important than the speed. Because direction determines outcome, which brings everything back to the question that now matters more than anything else. If this same process continues, expanding from drones into every system that once had to be imported, how long before the balance between dependence and control is no longer even recognizable? Let us know in the comments section, how do you see this initiative? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.